when they didn't pay him, he wouldn't know that wasn't what. Seriously, I really wish I was lying to you.
Well, okay.
Yeah, we've tried to get hold of Jennison to find out if they ever paid him, because the first guy that we hired to do the cover was a superhero, kind of big name American artist.
Yeah.
And after he had delivered the cover 2 months later, he had direct contact with Ian, and he said, "Hey Ian, how come they never paid me?"
Yeah.
And so we went to HarperCollins and said, "You guys, the people aren't getting paid," and they had a check the next day, but it was they went to Jennison because he would work cheap. I mean, and I'm not saying that Ian kept saying he's probably locked in the basement of his mother's fish house. and we would always have these, we would imagine what horrible circumstances they were making him, he had to draw with one shackle on his arm. But that's why they picked him. I can honestly tell you that, and we found this out at Comic-Con, that if anybody had heard of these guys, they would work with them. And
really?
so, because Ian had a list. I was working on a novel at the time. I was finishing up Sakura Blue, which will come out in April. And it'll be fun to see all you guys back. And so I sort of, punted to Ian and said, you pick all these guys, or you research these guys. And so he had a long list of artists that he found. And everybody we'd go to would be, quote, busy, unquote. Well, they weren't busy. They just didn't want to work with this packager because they'd heard of them before. But this poor kid in the Philippines was like, "Sure, I'd like a job," and that was how it happened.
Yeah.
This is like I'm sorry, I didn't realize how depressing this was.
We can change tack here.
No, let's go.
Not that I think it was a bad decision.
He's buried under the floorboards.
I mean, manga style is very popular these days with younger people, especially. Well, okay. So you mentioned Ian. You had a list of your list of artists that you would like to see working with you. Are you a comic? Have you been a comics fan? Are you both comics fans? Is this something that you've wanted to do for some time, is to write a comic?
Yeah, I mean, I really never set out to write comics. I write screenplays primarily, and I've written for different magazines, and I've just written a novel as well. And so I'm getting more into that world. But I've been a comic book fan. So I grew up with Daredevil and various comic book heroes. And Daredevil was always my guy, and I was so completely heartbroken when they did such a bad movie. It took me literally a decade to forgive Ben Affleck for that. It just bummed me out, him sniveling on the rooftop while Elektra's fighting his battle. But no, I've always loved comic books, and so for me it was just a lot of fun to have a chance to work in this arena.
And Christopher,
yeah, me too.
Yeah.
No, I when I was littler, I lived in a little teeny town, and so Saturday was going downtown and buying your comic book, and it's really weird because it's really kind of how I live my life now as a writer. Except instead of sitting down and having a Coke, I would sit down and have coffee in the morning. But I would read my comic book, and spend my allowance on that, and Sergeant Rock and Spider-Man and Hawkman and those guys. And I think probably from the time I was about 12 on, it became Mad Magazine, and that was my sort of graphic novel experience. But when I was a little kid, I was a big comics fan, and I hadn't thought about writing them at all until Marvel called. I just didn't, I didn't know how. I mean, we literally had to learn how to do it. It was like, what the hell does a comic script look like? Well, I really thought that at one point we could just hand them the movie script and go, and it turned out it was harder to adapt it to a comic script than it actually was to write the movie script from scratch, because there's so much description. Alan Moore, who does, arguably, I guess he's the most famous graphic novel guy in the world, who did V is for Vendetta and Extraordinary Gentlemen and stuff. He does a full typed page for every panel. And if you figure there's 140 pages and an average of about 6 panels per page, that's a book about that thick. So we didn't do that. In fact, we had to go back at times and go, she's standing up, or because you're not supposed to. Ian teaches screenwriting, and one of the things you teach people is don't direct from the script. Don't tell the director what to do. And we had to. And so what we had to learn were really bad habits. So hopefully that hasn't ruined everything from here on out.
I've read that you're not big into doing rewriting when you work on your novels. Was there much in the way of revision while you were, when the script went to the artwork stage? Was there any sort of back and forth with revising the story?
There should have been. No, I mean there should have been. In fact, we should have had gone through and added more dialogue and description. But we never saw the art from the time that it was drawn and then the dialogue was put in. So there's. I'm not saying this to discourage you. It's an awesome thing. But there are pages where we're not sure what's on the page, and we wrote it. So if we had a chance to go back, I would have maybe put a thing like, "This is a crashed spaceship," not just a lump of gray stuff. But I don't rewrite my novels much. But Ian is a screenwriter. Screenwriters rewrite. Here, you talk.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that's one of the things about Hollywood and I think that's part of the reason why it's so many bad movies is that it's filmmaking or storytelling by committee. So you always have people that are not qualified to be telling you what to do. And, I think that's one of the greatest challenges of being a professional writer is taking, suggestions from somebody that aren't going to make your story better and finding a way to incorporate those suggestions solely to appease their ego and yet maintain the integrity of the story that you set out to tell. So it's a tough balancing act, it really is. And so, in novels you don't have that, but in Hollywood you definitely have that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't do it much after we've converted it. I think we had a lot of discussions when we were turning it into a graphic novel, just saying this scene doesn't work if you don't have real physical movement. And I think we lost some of the comedy because of that. Because there was, the thing that was cool about writing an action movie that was funny was most aren't. And so we could actually write some sight gags, and they clearly didn't work if you drew them in a static way. So we changed it, but most of it was on the first pass. Ian and I are not. When we work together, we're not over analytical. I've actually been in the room when other screenwriters were working together, and they discuss every single thing, and I'm like, how do you guys ever get anything done? And you've got to quit smoking dope when you write. And Ian and I are like, you get scene 1, I get scene 2. Here you have scene. You're better with this character, and we walk out of the room, each with a stack of index cards, and then usually Ian glues it together, and it comes out of script. So the reworking was usually. It wasn't laborious, and there was nobody to yell at and tell them that they're a fucking idiot, which is what I normally do in Hollywood meetings, which is why I don't work them.